kind of started thinking about what might be useful to kind of talk about. I suppose being of this age, I actually have a sort of a long story behind me to look over, and it really is interesting to kind of see the changes that have taken place in Ireland over the past 30 or 40 years. And I suppose that's where my taking heart comes into. If you kind of think of what do we mean by taking heart, it really is about something that the students were saying about building our confidence, but also building our courage. And your poem was so about taking into account our history and harvesting what our history tells us so that we really can sort of have a more optimistic future. Of course, the word courage itself comes from, any Latin scholars here, from the heart. You know, it really is about sort of connecting in with our heart. And I suppose when I started working in community education first, one of the books that we used to use was Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And I suppose that really is the kind of society that we're living in quite, you know, just at the moment. The politics of fear really has been used as really a weapon against people. It has also been used to really shape global politics in so many ways. And, you know, there's so many documentaries really about how the politics of fear works in the United States. But it works really everywhere. It might be more subtle, or we mightn't be as aware of it here because we're kind of like immersed in our society. But the politics of fear really constrain us in a fundamental way, so as that we really, you know, we almost cannot walk down the street at night time because of fear. We're also fearful of authority figures, people who tell us what to do. It really makes us very, very compliant. And I suppose the more I read about the politics of fear, the more I know that the only thing that actually can combat the politics of fear is the politics of courage. So I'm using the word politics really deliberately, not as a big P idea, but as a small p. That is the way we engage with our lives, our daily lives, the way we read the media, the way our minds and hearts are influenced by things that are all around us. And I suppose the whole idea of how courage works is that we really do have to open our eyes. I know it sounds so trivial and trite, but there is a kind of sense that things are so difficult just now, is that it's almost, makes us depressed and passive in giving up our power, but we do have an awful lot of power. And one of the ways that we really can exercise that power is to actually look at education as a social institution. So if we kind of look at what ought education to do, and education really is the key route towards making a more equal society. So if you kind of look at, you know, any policies around education from the foundation of this state, you'll really kind of see that it has a social message. And that social message is always about the population. You know, what did the young government want for the population of Ireland? What changes have been made? I remember when free second level education came in 1969, and what a huge impact that made. That is, that the whole idea of making education free to everybody, at that time, it was really a huge proportion of the population that left school at the age of 14, or sometimes at the age of 15, but there was a huge proportion of the population. So the story of what education ought to do is really part and parcel of the ambition society has for the population. But we also want to see, again, looking at the film that you showed, Liz, you know, how is it that if the aspiration of education is to sort of create a more equal society, that we have such inequality? So the figures for the young population and unemployment are terrifying. You know, if you kind of think of if 20% of the population was sort of counted collectively in any other sphere, we really would be terrified, because it is terrifying. So what is it about education that has created this huge division? And I suppose what we have to kind of see, again, looking over the history, what has happened since free second level education came in 1969? And what we really kind of see is almost like social engineering in many ways, that the sort of like the highly resourced education institutions sort of, well, they really were intent on creating what we might call in sort of crude terms the ruling class. And other education institutions were really sort of seen as, you know, this is serving a group of people that aren't really that bright, and that their main purpose in life really has to be to become a really quite compliant workforce. Now, I know that sounds very cynical, and that it really doesn't give credit to all the teachers and educators that are really intent on serving the population. But sort of just moving away, in fact, just looking at the map, that is just moving out so that you see an overall picture. We really do have to question, why is it that there's a population that is left out? And I suppose one of the most wonderful things that have happened in my life and in my experience really was the sort of community education. So I started working in community education about 30 years ago. And one of the things that would really be seen about community education is that it wasn't driven by educators or policymakers. And I think that is really, really important. It is really driven by people who are really committed to development, to their own development, to the development of new ideas, new ways of working, and so on. And that really emerged very, very quickly. My first sort of classes were in 1985, and everything was to do with listening to what learners wanted and really responding to those needs. And really it was out of that. You know, there's a kind of like a sense you can't trust people to know what's good for them. But in fact, that is exactly sort of like the opposite of what can happen when we actually sort of work with people in order to identify their needs and work towards meeting those needs. So, I mean, obviously the Shanty and then on Cusson came out of those early years, but you know, there was other education centres and so on. But I suppose the Shanty really sort of really quickly gained that pioneering role that influenced the sector. But again, it really was about listening to what learners wanted and responding to those needs. So I suppose when the white paper in adult education was written in the year 2000, the real recognition of community education was highlighted. And the kind of ideas that came from that really centred on the approaches to education. You know, what way are we in the learning environment? What kind of learning do we want? And what kind of input do we want in terms of of what we want out of that. And I suppose I really, really hoped in the year 2000 that, formal education at second level and in higher education, that the next thing, the scales would fall from their eyes and people would kind of say, this is what we need in higher education, this is what we need at second level, and especially at upper second level. But in fact, that didn't happen. But because of the success and the capacity to reach, very hard to reach, populations and communities, one of the most, I suppose, the most urgent things that emerged from that white paper was what we kind of call now co-option. That is that community education was seen as, if we look at these hard to reach populations, we can put them into different environments. So all we need is a sort of like a community educator who is able to facilitate sort of different hard to reach groups and slot them in different arena. That is really one of the key challenges for community education. What we want is to cooperate without being co-opted. So it cannot be part of an agenda for something quite at odds with the vision for community education. I suppose another challenge really was, will I see it here now? Oh yeah, suppression. I think it's hard to believe that I forget that. So when we look at the ways in which community education projects sort of thrived and nourished and really supported people, there was a real, especially at around the time of austerity, I don't know if many people here were involved in community education, community development at that particular time, but there was a series of loops or hoops put into place so as that it was harder and harder and harder to jump through those hoops. And the impact ultimately was to suppress the initiatives, so as that people really struggled to sort of hold on to their foothold in the community and to learners and so on. So suppression really was so disheartening. I know of people who looked back on what they had done over the previous, so many years, 15 years or so, and saw it all spread out in front of them in ruins. And I suppose, again, we really have to pay huge tribute to An Cusán, to that really sort of maintained the head over water during those years, but it was so difficult. And I suppose devaluing then is the third real challenge that community education faced. I have often heard people saying, well, in fact, quite prominent people in my institution saying, you bring people into this institution who have a reading age of 5 and you give them a certificate. And I really was so angry when I heard that. But there's a kind of like a sense about that if you don't go through the traditional route, if you don't come from the more elite educational institutions, that there's something wrong with your intelligence and your capacity and so on that is really so downplayed and not recognised in these institutions. And I know that this really was a hugely traumatic time for so many people to be devalued in that. So many people I know were so proud of their certificates and their achievements that when somebody said something demeaning like that had crushed them. And you know, one of the things about, say, something like second chance education, which again is an initiative that really has flourished in community education, sometimes it's not second chance, it's first chance. So many people who are in this category of second chance education are actually having their first chance because they never had a chance to start off with. And that was really this was their chance to flourish. And if that is crushed, then a person is crushed to their very soul. However, as Thabo Mbeki said, gloom and despondency never defeated adversity. What we need is courage and resilience. And I suppose that's really why the politics of courage is so important. Community education really did come from courage. And when we kind of look at the early pioneers, we really kind of see that they took their courage in their hands and they went for it. As I say, it wasn't led out by policymakers or educational institutions or indeed sort of academic educators. It really was led by the people. And I suppose what people like myself and Aintus and the Shanty and An Cussan did was really facilitated that. And that really is hugely important. And it really has impacted on the type of education that is increasingly being offered in institutions. So it's changing institutions. So in my own university, they're offering critical thinking skills to first and second year traditional age students. And I suppose the difference between talking the talk and walking the walk is really so clear in this rollout. So there's people who are sort of, in fact, I know one person who has sort of like a book opened on a certain page that he probably opened for the past 40 years. And he projects that onto a screen and he reads. And that's his idea of critical skills. And I suppose what community education really emphasizes, that critical skills isn't just about critical ideas, because we can all have critical ideas. But it really is about the way we work with people. It is about relationship. It is about valuing the person. It's really about being aware of ourselves. And it's really been about commitment to the overall project of what community education has to be about. And community education really has to be about enhancing the human spirit. There's actually no, obviously there are things that will happen, like fulfilling the government's agenda on labour activation or employment or, more solid community provision and all of these things. But those are secondary to the idea of building the human spirit collectively and individually. And I suppose when we really grasp what education ought to do, we can really see that this is what happens in community education. So I think that we really have to take our inspiration from that history. We have to harvest the ideas that emerged from that, the practice, the environment, the learning environment, the type of stuff that is learned, the kind of way in which it's learned, the kind of skills that we have to sort of enable so as that people really do have the courage to foresee or to have a vision of a more equal society. And I suppose that is what we owe. This is what we owe now to ourselves and of course to our children. So I think that's it. That's all right.